90% of your brain's architecture is built before you turn 5. 90%. And yet, society spends its entire time diagnosing who you are as an adult, your anxiety, your drive, your inability to rest, without ever asking what you were asked to carry when you were small. Most people absorb that story and call it personality, but you already sense it goes deeper than that. You already feel that somewhere underneath the version of you that shows up, hustles, performs, and holds everything together, there is a quieter truth, and that truth started long before you had words for it. You weren't always like this. There was a version of you that existed before the grades mattered, before the expectations arrived, before you learned without anyone explicitly teaching you that your worth had conditions attached. That child was curious, loud probably, unhurried. They didn't apologize for taking up space because no one had told them yet that space was something that had to be earned. Then something shifted. Maybe it was a parent whose love felt warmest when you succeeded. Maybe it was a teacher who only noticed you when you performed. Maybe it was subtler than that. Just the quiet withdrawal of warmth when you got it wrong, and the immediate restoration of closeness when you got it right. You were young, and you were perceptive, so you did what any intelligent child does. You adapted. You became excellent. You became responsible. You became the one who didn't need to be asked twice. And somewhere in that becoming, you started to believe that the adapted version of you was the real one. But here's what nobody tells you. It wasn't who you were. It was who you learned to be in order to stay safe in a world that felt contingent on your performance. Psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades at Stanford studying something she called contingent self-worth, the degree to which a person's sense of value depends on external outcomes rather than their intrinsic sense of self. What she found wasn't just that high-pressure childhoods produced high-achieving adults. It was that those adults become almost constitutionally incapable of rest. Their nervous systems literally don't know how to downshift because the internal architecture was built on a foundation of if-then. If I perform well, then I am lovable. If I succeed, then I am enough. You feel this. It's not a mindset problem. It's not laziness or weakness in reverse. It is a neural pattern, deeply grooved, early carved, that fires automatically the moment you slow down or stop producing. The unease you feel on a quiet Sunday afternoon, that isn't anxiety. That is your childhood architecture running its original programming. And here's what nobody tells you about that. The fact that you can name it is already evidence that you are no longer entirely inside it. Here is the reframe that changes everything, and it requires you to look back, not to assign blame, but to understand the blueprint. When you were a child living under pressure, your brain was not malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what a human brain is designed to do. It was learning the rules of its environment so it could keep you connected to the people you depended on to survive. Striving wasn't a flaw you developed, it was a solution you invented. The perfectionism, the hypervigilance, the inability to let yourself off the hook, these were your younger self's most brilliant engineering. They kept you close to love. They kept you visible in rooms where invisibility felt dangerous. It is not a flaw. It is a blueprint your younger self drew to survive. The problem isn't that you drew it. The problem is that you are still living by a blueprint designed for a world that no longer exists, in a body that is no longer 7 years old, trying to earn safety that you are now finally allowed to simply have. But here is the part that other videos won't say out loud. These patterns don't just cost you comfort, they cost you health. The American Psychological Association has linked chronic self-monitoring and performance anxiety, behaviors that begin in high-pressure childhoods, to measurably elevated cortisol levels, increased risk of burnout, and disrupted sleep architecture that compounds over decades. A Harvard longitudinal study tracking adults across 80 years found that people who reported high parental pressure in childhood were significantly more likely to describe their adult relationships as transactional, a pattern of giving, helping, and achieving, not from desire, but from a deep-seated fear that simply existing is never quite enough. You feel the cost of this in your body, the tension in your jaw when you make a mistake, the way a single piece of criticism can undo hours of confidence. the exhaustion that isn't fixed by sleep. These are not character weaknesses, but they are real signals, and acknowledging them isn't pessimism, it is the only honest starting point for changing them. Now here's what the research also shows, and this is the part you're going to want to sit with. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Personality found that adults who experienced high performance expectations in childhood and who developed a secure sense of self alongside those expectations demonstrated significantly higher levels of what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, not just resilience, but an expanded capacity for empathy, for nuanced thinking, for holding complexity without collapsing under it. In other words, the same pressure that forged the wound also forged the instrument. You don't think in straight lines. You read rooms before you walk into them. You notice what other people miss because you spent years developing that skill to stay one step ahead. You carry a seriousness of purpose that most people simply don't have access to, not because you chose it, but because it was earned in a place where the stakes were always real. The depth of feeling that your childhood taught you to manage quietly is the same depth that makes you extraordinary at what you do. The cost was real, but so is what it built inside you. Society gave you a set of labels that never fit. Overachiever, as if caring deeply were a flaw. People pleaser, as if the instinct to preserve connection were something embarrassing. Anxious, as if your nervous system were simply malfunctioning, rather than executing a very old, very competent strategy. None of those words see you accurately. The word that gets closer is adaptive. You are an adaptive person, someone whose intelligence expressed itself early and sideways, not in defiance of difficulty, but in response to it. You didn't overachieve, you over-survived. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else you will hear today, because it locates the origin of your behavior, not in weakness, not in a need to prove something, but in a form of intelligence that was doing its absolute best with what it had. Society calls you high-strung. The real word is finely calibrated. If you made it this far, there's a version of you that is still not entirely sure you deserve to hear this. A part of you that listened to everything and is already looking for the caveat, already mentally composing the ways in which your specific case is more complicated, more irredeemable, more your fault than what was described. I want to speak directly to that part. There is nothing wrong with you. There never was. The pressure was real, your response was intelligent, and the fact that you are here, asking these questions, searching for understanding rather than someone to blame, is not a small thing. That is precisely what growth looks like from the inside. Where do you go from here? You begin exactly where you are, not with a plan, not with a new habit, not with a list of things to fix, but with the decision to stop treating your own nervous system as the problem. The work is not becoming someone new. The work is becoming less afraid of who you already are. Tell me in the comments, what is the one belief about yourself that childhood pressure planted that you are finally ready to question? I read every single one. You were never the problem. You were always enough.